All right, peace and greetings. So, I wanted to share some information with you about the slave trade that took place on the continent of Africa, and we'll be focused on Nigeria, right? So, this article is from the BBC.com. It's a British news website. The title of it is My Nigerian Great Grandfather Sold Slaves. And looked like this article was posted on July 19th, 2020. Let's zoom in a little bit. All right. Now it says, amid the global debate about race relations, colonialism, and slavery, some of the Europeans and Americans who made their fortunes in trading human beings have seen their legacies reassessed, their statues toppled, and their names removed from public buildings. Nigerian journalist and novelist Adeobi Trisha Nwabani writes that one of her ancestors sold slaves, but argues that he should not be judged by today's standards or values. My great-grandfather, Nwabani, or Nwabani, however you say that, Ogogo Oriaku, was what I prefer to call a businessman from the Igbo ethnic group of southeastern Nigeria. He dealt in a number of goods, including tobacco and palm produce. He also sold human beings. He had agents who captured slaves from different places and brought them to him, my father told me. Nwabani Ogogo slaves were sold through the ports of Calabar and Bonny in the south of what is today known as Nigeria. People from ethnic groups along the coast, such as the Efik and Ijaw, right, usually acted as stevedores for the white merchants and as middlemen for Igbo traders, like my great-grandfather. They loaded and offloaded ships and supplied the foreigners with food and other provisions. They negotiated prices for slaves from the hinterlands, then collected royalties from both the sellers and the buyers. So this is straight out slave trading. All right, it says about 1.5 million Igbo slaves were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between the 15th and 19th centuries. So that means the so-called Negroes in the United States were being bought and sold or slave traded through this process that we're reading about, right? And the Africans took part in that. So just because somebody is African or has black skin does not mean they are your friend, right? Just because their skin looks like yours, if they enslaved you and sold you, that's still your enemy. More than 1.5 million Africans were shipped to what was then called the New World, the Americas, through the Calabar port in the Bight of Bonny, making it one of the largest points of exit during the transatlantic trade. The transatlantic slave trade, captives taken from Africa to the Americas and Europe, 16th through 19th century. So you see this map here, right? Just showing you the routes they took, taking us from Africa to South America, to Jamaica, to Cuba, and of course to North America, the United States. The only life they knew. So the woman whose image you see here, she is the author of this article, is her great-grandfather. Nwabani Ogogo lived in a time when the fittest survived and the bravest excelled. The concept of, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, was completely alien to traditional religion and law in his society. So obviously they were not paying any attention to the Bible. So here is why I say that obviously they were not paying any attention to the Bible. Because in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, it reads, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Let's get a parallel on that. So Exodus 21 and 16 in the New International Version, it says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So this slave trading is not tolerated by the Bible. So whatever religion that they did not have to show them that this was wrong, they obviously were not paying any attention to the Bible. So I just wanted to bring that out because they said the concept of, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, was completely alien to traditional religion and law in his society. But we don't care about their law. They enslaved our people and sold them, and it was evil. And according to the Old Testament, they should have been put to death, which means today they don't need to try to make an excuse for it, because if they do, they are no better than these Europeans in the United States trying to make an excuse for the Confederate flag and the slavery which it does represent. All right, and so you see that quote there. Assessing the people of Africa's past by today's standards would compel us to cast the majority of our heroes as villains. Well, that's their problem. If your heroes happen to be villains, then it is what it is. Let's continue. Igbo slave traders, like my great-grandfather, did not suffer any crisis of social acceptance or legality. They did not need any religious or scientific justifications for their actions. They were simply living the life into which they were raised. That was all they knew. So I wonder if their slave trade included raping our women as well. Would this sister say that was all they knew too? To kidnap and sell the men and to rape the women and sell them too? See, it's ridiculous. We know things were different back then, but we still can't make an excuse for it. Human beings were human beings then and living souls then, just like they're living souls now. Their value as living souls have not changed. So if it's wrong today, that means it was wrong then. For all these people that want to be so-called Christians, you had Christianity in Africa during this slave trade. So why didn't they follow the love of Jesus Christ when it came to that? Let's continue. Let's go on down. Slaves buried alive. Let me just skip on down to the main point here. Buying and selling of human beings among the Igbo had been going on long before the Europeans arrived. I need you to remember that. Remember that Africans, right, dark-skinned Africans, were buying and selling human beings, and you know what human beings those included so-called Negroes. Among the Igbo had been going on long before the Europeans arrived. So for those who say the so-called white man is the devil, because the ones that participated in our slavery, and some of them say that all the so-called white men is the devil. I'm not going to say that. But I do know that a large amount of them secretly still agree with slavery. And so any European that agrees with the enslavement of my people like it was okay, they are indeed a devil. My question to you is, what are these black Africans who sold us into slavery? What should we call them? Righteous? Saints? No, they're devils too, because it means they're our enemy. The devil or Satan means the enemy of God's people, the adversary. That's all it really means. People became slaves as punishment for crime, payment for debts, or prisoners of war. The successful sale of adults was considered an exploit for which a man was hailed by praise singers, akin to exploits of wrestling, war, or in hunting animals like the lion. Now, I'm going to show you the deception. See, for them to try to sugarcoat it like people became slaves as punishment for crime, payment for debts, or prisoners of war. So you mean to tell me all of the so-called Negroes that was taken into North America and South America, they were all criminals? Men, women, and children, right? Right. Babies. And I guess the way they punish criminal women is to rape them too, right? And to have more children by them and make them slaves like they did over here. Straight up garbage. This African woman is clearly trying to excuse her great-grandfather's behavior. So I don't want to hear nothing about it was punishment for a crime. No, we was enslaved. Our ancestors were enslaved by these Africans because these Africans were wicked, just like the Europeans who came later on and joined in the slave trade. Igbo slaves served as domestic servants and laborers. They were sometimes also sacrificed in religious ceremonies. Pay attention to this. They were sometimes also sacrificed in religious ceremonies and buried alive. What crime were they being punished for with that? What kind of sadistic filth is that? You see? So I'm not giving these Africans who did that a pass. They're just as wicked as these Europeans who did it to us. My enemy is anyone who either enslaved my people or today is okay with the idea of us being enslaved and still trying to make excuses for it. That's my enemy. And if you are a so-called Negro over here in the United States, if you still have any wisdom left, they should be yours too. That is, unless you like slavery. If you don't mind getting your back whipped and working for free for the rest of your life, then maybe they're your friend. But if you feel like me, these people are your enemy. So stop judging people by the color of their skin and start judging them by the spirit in which they operate. If they operate by the evil spirit of oppression and slavery, then they're the devil. Point blank, period. They are a devil in the flesh. Now let's continue. It says they were buried alive after their religious ceremony. So in a religious sacrifice, people are cut and made to bleed. You know that, right? And then they were buried alive. Can you imagine somebody cutting you, you're bleeding, after some weird African religious ceremony, and then you buried alive with their masters to attend to them in the next world? You can't make this stuff up. That is a foolish religion. That slave master ain't going to tend to you in the next world because they're going to be getting judged in the next world. You understand? Slavery was so ingrained in the culture that a number of popular Igbo proverbs make reference to it. In other words, African proverbs. So I want y'all to hear this first great African proverb they're going to quote here. Anyone who has no slave is his own slave. Can you believe that? What kind of African proverb is that? Anyone who has no slave is his own slave. So they justifying slavery by saying if you don't have a slave, then you are your own slave. Can't make this stuff up. A slave who looks on while a fellow slave is tied up and thrown into the grave with his master should realize that the same thing could be done to him someday. It is when the son is being given advice that the slave learns. Let's see. The arrival of European merchants offering guns, mirrors, gin, and other exotic goods in exchange for humans massively increased demand, leading people to kidnap others and sell them. All right, so now let's see how the Most High feels about what we just read, right? It says in Joel chapter 3, starting at verse 2, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, right? Because you so-called Negroes in the United States are the Israelites, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. Verse 3, and they have cast lots for my people and have given a boy for an harlot and sold a girl for wine, that they might drink. Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coast of Palestine? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. Now let's get Psalms 83. I want y'all to see. It's not only the so-called white man, these Europeans, that's been your enemy. It's these Africans who look very similar to us, right? Psalm 83 and 1. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. So when God said he going to plead with these nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat, that means he going to plead with them by war and destruction. But for the sake of time, took you to Psalms 83 to show you, watch this here. These nations, all these nations consulted against God's hidden ones, not just the European. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee, the tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. I want y'all to know this includes these so-called Africans. That's what I'm trying to get you to see. So this is not for you to hate people that look like you. I'm telling you, you need to realize that some of your enemies look similar to you, and some of them look like they're the so-called white man. So you have to judge them by their spirit and by their activity. And what a man says or what a woman says, like that article we were reading, it shows what's really in their heart. If they're still trying to make excuses for the enslavement and rape, torture, and selling of your people, that means they're your enemy. Point blank, period. Now let's see. How slaves were traded in Africa. European buyers tended to remain on the coast. So in other words, these Europeans would be on the west coast of Africa near the ocean, right? Near the Atlantic Ocean. African sellers brought slaves from the interior on foot. So let me show you what that looks like on the map. So you'd have the Europeans along this coastline where I'm moving my mouse, right? Where you see these black dots pointing to these blue lines, right? And the African slave traders would go into the interior, like around here somewhere, right? A little deeper into the land. And literally drag or walk them to these shores to then be sold and handed over to the so-called white man and then put on the ship to make that dreadful middle passage, of which many of them died before they even got to the Americas, right? That's how they treated our people. So which one of these is our enemy? The African slave traders who took us from the interior of Africa to the coastline, or the Europeans who took us across the water to their land and enslaved us? You see, both of them are our enemies. That's called truth. It might be an uncomfortable truth because then you got to accept that your original slave traders look like this woman. And by the way, that's how the ancient Egyptians looked at the time that they had Moses and the children of Israel enslaved. When God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, the Egyptians was black like this. Facts. And before we close out here, let me find where those points were at. Hold on. Yeah. So journeys could be as long as 485 kilometers or 300 miles. So having to walk on foot for up to 300 miles, chained up, right? 2 captives were typically chained together at the ankle. Columns of captives were tied together by ropes around their necks. 10% to 15% of captives died on the way. So that just shows you how bad it was. So for the sake of time, I'll cut this off now, and I might continue it later with another video on the same or similar topic. I hope this has been some edification. Don't hate and judge people based on their appearance, right? But you got to judge by their spirit. You shall know a tree by its fruits. So I'm just making it plain. Anybody that feels like it's justifiable or okay for you and your people to be enslaved, that's your real enemy. All right, so with that, shalom, shalom. Have a blessed day on this holy Sabbath day, at least as of this recording, right? And for those of you who may or may not know what the Sabbath is or may not keep it, perhaps you could take some time to learn. I may be posting some videos about that as well. All right, so share your comments or thoughts in the comment section to let me know if you didn't know about this or if this is new to you or how do you feel about this or whatever. Because my goal is to try to be reasonable and rational, and instead of trying to blame only a certain group of people who are Caucasian, we need to look at the fact that we have multiple enemies in this world. And it's not always about skin color, but it's about a bloodline. Right. So the truth, when you share the truth, it forces you to face reality. And reality is not always what we want it to look like. See, I would love to be able to say this woman here is my sister. But you notice I refer to her as the woman in here, not my sister, because she ain't. If Becky was in this picture and she was trying to justify the Confederacy and trying to explain why her forefathers, all they knew was to put us on the plantation and make us pick cotton and grow coffee and all of that, you see, we say she was a racist devil trying to make excuses for her Caucasian, racist Klansman great-grandfather. But when it's a sister that looks like this, with dark skin, now what we gonna say? We gonna say the truth. She's our enemy as well. And matter of fact, don't let me leave this part out. Yeah, it's something y'all need to know about this slave trade. Not just that it happened. I need you to know how long it lasted. Yeah. Let me just get to it. Just a moment. Let me keep scrolling. Here we go. Slave trade in the 20th century. Acclaimed Igbo historian Adiele Afibo described the slave trade in southeastern Nigeria, which lasted until the late 1940s and early 1950s, as one of the best kept secrets of the British colonial administration. So there you go. So they are our enemies. Because at least over here, our people in the 40s and 50s were just dealing with Jim Crow and segregation, but at least they weren't literally having their backs whipped on the plantation. Legally, right? All right, so with that, hope this has been some edification, and have a good day.